Okay, dedications for Shipra Simcha Bat Yeta, for Selma Bat Rachel, Adi Luri, Natan Bat Elaine Simcha, and other Cholim of Chalak Klal Yisrael.
Man.
Okay, so
sorry.
The next halacha is sewing. Sewing, there are 3 prohibitions. Sewing with a needle and a thread. Gluing, stapling, or taping articles together. Tightening cloth at a seam by pulling the thread. A zip may be used since it is regularly closed and opened. Similarly, one may use Velcro. Next point. Certain authorities permit the use of disposable diapers secured with sticky tapes as they are intended to be unstuck later. Similarly, Band-Aid plaster dressings may be applied to the skin. Plastic wrap may be used but may not be cut or torn from the roll. The temporary use of safety pins for replacing a button, securing bandages, or other such needs is permitted. So plastic wrap may be used, anything, foil as well. It doesn't say foil there, aluminium foil, tin foil, you also can't tear. You can't tear anything, it has to be pre-torn before Shabbos. So that falls under sewing.
Guys, I'll just tell you where we ended off yesterday in 43b3, where there was this answer that basically Rabba gave a buyer. I'm just going to go through it in review for a minute. Rabba said to a buyer, however, where the first clause, and we're not talking the first clause in this Mishnah, guys, we're talking in Ketubot 41a. The owner is obligated to pay damages. In the second clause, he is not, for the following reason. When the victim was a free man, in which the ox's owner in certain circumstances pays kofar, even by his own admission, and in what is the case where this is so? For if witnesses come and testify that the ox killed a person and is liable to death, but they do not know if it was a tam, in which case the owner is exempt from kofar, or muad, in which case the owner is liable for kofar. And its owner says that it's muad, this in a case where he pays kofar by his own admission, since the fact is the ox is liable to be executed. So this is actually what Arthur mentioned yesterday, is most people with a conscience, if their ox had killed somebody and they know that it provides divine immunity, where they could technically get out of it because the witnesses are trusting this individual, Hashem knows better if this person is lying or not. So in the case where the witnesses saw the event, but they don't know the track record of the animal, if it's tam or muad, in that particular case, they ask the owner. Now, either way, it doesn't matter, because if he doesn't pay kofar, he pays damages, and since he's paying the same amount either way, he might as well also get the divine atonement. Does that make sense? Although the theory goes that he wouldn't really pay damages or kofar, because if you're holding by Rav Eliezer, who expounded the verse with the case of a tam, when it says perhaps we pay half kofar, you don't, because if the animal gets the death penalty, from what are you paying it from? And in this case, the animal would get the death penalty, so we pay tam damages from the body of the attacking animal. And so the witnesses aren't going to make sure he doesn't pay damages. And if you say he wants to pay damages again, where are damages paid? From the body of the attacking animal. So he technically gets off if he says tam, whereas with muad he has to pay kofar damages. But Shemaim holds him accountable, and as Arthur said, most Jewish people have a conscience. So in that particular case, he pays by his own admission. Why? Well, firstly, it's a kofar. It's not a penalty. That's number one. And number two, why is he paying kofar? Because according to Rabbah, there's a relationship between whether the ox is executed and kofar payment occurs. Where there's no killing of the ox, there's no kofar, but you pay damages. In this case, there's two witnesses, and therefore it's not the owner's testimony. He's corroborating the witnesses, but it's the witnesses that are coming to technically provide evidence to have the ox executed. So fine, that makes sense so far. Well, then, when there are no witnesses at all, he nevertheless pays damages. Well, that makes sense, because if the ox is not executed because there's no kofir, if the ox is not executed because there's no witnesses, then there'll be no kofir. So according to Rabba's dictum, then damages are assessed, according to the value of the victim anyway. But it says, hang on a second, in regard to where the victim was a slave, in which case the owner does not even pay the 30 shekel fine by his own admission. Why? Because it's different there. The only thing that with regards to the kofir payment, the owner by his own admission can't execute the ox. Just like if a person admitted to a murder, he doesn't get the death sentence, so too his ox can't get the death penalty based on his admission. However, he still pays damages. Here, the 30 shekel fine is seen as a knas, a penalty, because it's a fixed amount irrespective of what the slave is worth. So if there are witnesses, okay, so we could see that he might have to pay. But when there are no witnesses, it's obvious he doesn't have to pay. It's a knas, it's a penalty. Fine. And what is the parallel case that illustrates this? So we said, okay, he doesn't ever pay the fine, 30 shekel fine by his own admission. So that's understandable. It's a knas. And what is the liable case that illustrates this? The parallel case. For if witnesses come and testify that the ox killed a slave, but they do not know if it was tam, in which case the 30 shekel penalty does not apply. Why does it not apply? Because again, it's being paid from the body of the attacking animal. And if witnesses come, the animal's being put to death. Fine. But if it's muad, in which case the penalty does apply, and the owner says it's muad, the fine is not paid by his own admission. Then when there are no witnesses at all, he doesn't pay damages either. And we said, look, it's very simple. This is how Rabba explains it. Rabba explains that when you come and confess, that in itself is a payment. It's a spiritual payment, and it's in lieu of financial payment. So if a person steals a laptop, they return it to the court before witnesses come, and they turn around and say, and he says, listen, I've done wrong, here's the laptop. He's not incumbent upon him to pay this penalty fine, which is the equivalent of the item he stole. He just has to return the item or pay the equivalent of the item he stole. Fine. So we are saying, in this particular case, where did Arthur go? Arthur did a Houdini.
Without us realizing, yeah?
Well, yeah.
You realize. But how long has he been gone for? We don't know.
No, I know, for a second or two. Don't worry, Gav. You're not losing your marbles. They were lost a long time ago. Let me just wait for Arthur to click on. I don't know what happened.
Thanks for the vote of confidence there.
Did you ever see, Stephen, there was that one Peter Pan with Robin Williams where he claimed he lost his marbles because it showed all the characters getting older. And he genuinely lost his physical marbles. Do you remember that? With Hook. I think it was called Hook.
Yeah. Hook, yes. Dustin Hoffman or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Arthur's about to join us again.
Yeah, also.
What happened?
It was like 20 years ago, maybe.
I reset the phone. Just reset itself, actually.
Okay, you're on the phone now.
No. The phone restarted on its own for some reason. It's got enough. I don't know why I did it.
All right, let's
put it back on. I'm recording.
Okay. So what Rob is saying is as follows. Look, the 30 shekel payment was he's not talking about a case. He's not talking about a case where witnesses come first. Because if witnesses come first, you can't get out of it by admitting to it. Does that make sense? That's it. Witnesses come first. That's it. You pay the penalty. But we're talking about a guy whose ox killed a slave, and he owes the 30 shekels and went to admit it in court. right? And then they say, okay, so you don't have to pay, you've admitted it, etc. Because you can't pay based on your own admission. That can get you off the hook with a knas, a penalty. Then witnesses have come to the court and said, listen, we saw his ox killed. His ox, it was, we don't know if it's tam or muad. They ask him, they say it's muad. They say his ox killed the slave. And then Rabba's saying he doesn't have to pay. But we're saying, well, why doesn't he even have to pay damages? Because if he doesn't have to pay the 30 shekel fine, then who's to say he doesn't have to pay damages? Because originally when Rabba bought his exposition, it was the fact when it says if he kills unintentionally, there's no kofir, and then it used a korah. He said very simple. Is that with the penalty payment, you don't pay by your own admission, and therefore it's considered when you admit it as if you've paid, because you've come clean, right? The owner of the ox is absolved, naki, come clean, absolved. So fine. In that he's admitted a similar sort of concept, then we don't make him pay the penalty because he admitted it. Now when the witnesses come and say, you owe for damages, it's too late. Why? Because it's considered as if he's paid the penalty by his admission. In other words, if he didn't admit and the witnesses come, he'd have to pay the penalty. Since he admitted before the witnesses came, it's as if he paid the penalty by his admission. Therefore, since he, inverted commas, paid the penalty by admitting such a thing, he doesn't have to pay damages in lieu of the penalty because he's considered paying the penalty. Now, you can imagine a buyer is not happy with this particular response, neither one or two other rabbis. Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak challenges Rabba's response from a brisa, and he says, whatever one is liable for when his ox kills a free person, he's also liable for when his ox kills a slave, whether in regard to kofir or in regard to the death of the ox. So what do we mean, hang on a second, with regard to the death of an ox? So we're saying, well, how does what does regard to the death of the ox means? So Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak explains the challenge. Now, the brisa can't mean that there's kofir for the death of a slave as there is death for a free person. For there is an obligation to pay kofir for a slave who was killed, is there? And he says, no. The Torah obligates payment of a special fine. Rather, when referring to liability to kofir, is not the brisa actually alluding to the damages to which one is liable when his ox kills? Okay. In other words, it's saying since the brisa comes to equate the payments for a free man and the slave, and there's no such thing as kofir for a slave, we must say that the brisa does not actually mean kofir at all, but rather damages, both in regard to a free man and in regard to a slave. So he's saying, look, if it's a case where the animal is not put to death, okay, then if you still owe the kofir for a free person, you would owe damages for a slave. So the brisa then states that in any circumstances in which there's an obligation to pay damages for the death of a free man, and when do you pay damages for the death of a free man? When the ox is not sentenced to death. So since you paid for damages for the death of somebody that's free, there exists a similar obligation when the victim is a slave. It's actually asking that question. So basically, what's happening here is Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak is saying the following, is saying, look, since you maintain that if one admits to his ox killing a free person, he must pay damages, why does the Mishnah in Ketubot state, according to your interpretation, Rabbi, that he's not obligated to pay when he admits that his ox killed a slave? Well, that's Rashi explaining this question. Obviously, then the Mishnah in Ketubot is not referring to damages, but rather to kofir and the 30 shekel payment. Thus, we see that a kofir payment is assessed even in cases where the ox is not executed. Okay? So, can you see the difference here, guys? If you see Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak is holding different to Rabbah. What is Rabbah saying? Is that when he's saying that when the ox is not killed, there's no kofir, you pay for damages. And obviously, this particular rabbi is turning around and saying something different. Is that even if the ox is not killed, you still then pay for kofir. And who resembles that sort of discussion? Rav Eliezer. Rav Eliezer says the same thing. Okay? So, obviously, then the Mishnah in Ketubot is not referring to damages, but rather to kofir and the 30 shekel payment. Thus, we see that a kofir payment is assessed even in cases in which the ox is not executed. Even Ravad and the Tosfot, Rabbeinu Peres agrees. So the question arises, since presumably Rav Shmuel by Rav Yitzchak is attempting to hold a bias proof, because again, this is what Bai is saying from the Mishnah, that kofir payment is in fact assessed when the owner admits that his ox killed, even though the ox isn't executed. It now emerges that there's no payment for damages in the case where the owner admits to the killing. Why? Because you don't pay guys kofir and damages. You either pay something labeled as kofir, which, as Gavin quite rightly said, is a compensation to the victim as well as the atonement factor. Or in a case where there's no atonement factor because the ox isn't killed, and therefore just like death compensates and atones for a person as well as a proper kapora, so to death of an ox also has that aspect where you pay the kapora kofir for when it kills a Jew. So the question is, how does Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak himself explain the brisa? In other words, to what payment of damages does the brisa refer? So that is saying, look, there are cases where kofir is not assessed. Okay? Can you guys think of an example? We've just learned it. Last up.
Where kofir is not assessed when the animal's not killed.
No. When the animal does kill somebody, I'll give it to you.
I'm saying when the animal's not put to death. Sorry, I didn't know.
No. There is a case where the animal is put to death and kofir is not assessed. I'll tell you when it is. When you've got the agent of a court, okay, and the agent of the court is appointed for people that are mental incompetence, okay, there's no kofir payment because a minor is not responsible for his actions. So even though the court-appointed agent was there to look after the animal, there's no kofir payment in that case. But of course, the animal's put to death. It's dangerous. So then the Gemara mentions, so there's no atonement because somebody with no mental competency can't feel guilty because he's a child. He doesn't know. He's mentally ill or whatever. But there's damages. Why is there damages? Because we learned that the court-appointed agent does a countdown. One of the things he does is a countdown. And what he does it for is to show their full damages from choice property, okay, which they have to pay for, the mental incompetence. I battle with two concepts here. I battle with the fact that the agent of the court doesn't have to pay half or something. We already said it's because nobody would volunteer for the job, but then it's technically coming out of the money of the mental incompetence. Because I suppose if you were damaged, you'd say, well, who's going to pay me? You know, the ox killed this person, how's the family going to live? But the reality is the reason there's no kofir is because those people don't have the capacity to see the consequence of their actions. That's why they had a court-appointed agent. The question arises why the court-appointed agent doesn't have to pay kofir, because he was negligent. In other words, instead of the family paying damages, we should say that for half payment damages or where somebody or another animal was damaged, fine, the mental incompetence have to pay. But where a person was killed, that's a different level of responsibility. We should say that the court-appointed agent has to pay kofir because he's cost the person's life here. Doesn't matter if he didn't volunteer for the job. The point of it is that you still now have an obligation to be responsible. So fine. So we see Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak's response and his question. So the Gemara answers. Let me just tell you what his question is again. It says, rather, when referring to liability to kofir, is not the brisa actually alluding to the damages to which one is liable when his ox kills? This brisa then states that in any circumstances in which there's an obligation to pay damages for the death of a free person, there exists a similar obligation when the victim was a slave. That's what he's proposing. So the Gemara answers, there are those who say that Rav Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak posed the challenge and he himself resolved it. And there are others that say that Rava said to him in response. This is what the brisa means. When one is liable to kofir for the killing of a free person, that is when his ox kills with intent, okay, according to the testimony of two witnesses, he is similarly liable to the fine for the death of a slave. And when one is liable to damages for the killing of a free man, so for example, when the ox kills unintentionally, according to the testimony of two witnesses, that's why he's paying damages. But we only pay kofir if the ox kills intentionally. He is similarly liable to damages for the killing of a slave where the ox kills unintentionally, according to the testimony of two witnesses. Okay? So we're saying is, so since the logic to exempt him from damages, it has to be parallel. If he pays damages, it seems, for a free person, he pays damages for a slave. However, when the incident is known only through the owner's admission, liability for the death of the slave, in fact, does not parallel liability for the death of a free man. Okay, so guys, obviously, because you pay damages for a free man, but nothing at all for the death of a slave, because Rava explained, okay? How did Rava explain it? Well, very simply, is that for a slave, it's considered as though if there are no witnesses, the 30 shekels is a penalty, and you can't obligate yourself to a penalty. So the minute you admit to the crime, it's as if you've paid the penalty, therefore you don't pay damages. And with regards to a free person, you have to pay the damages if you don't pay kofir, because you can't execute your ox by your own admission, just like you can't execute yourself by your own admission, but you're still damaged, and therefore it's not a penalty, it's a mamon, it's compensation, pure and simple, and that is why you pay the damages. Now, again, the bottom line is it's not considered a penalty 30 shekel fine, because if a slave is worth a dinner, you should pay a dinner. If a slave is worth a seller, you should pay a seller. You don't pay 30 shekels. A fixed amount is not indicative of the value of the slave. Therefore, it's a penalty. Okay? So, fine. So, basically, how do I put this? Look, the brisa doesn't disprove Rabba's interpretation of the Mishnah and Ketubot as referring to liability to damages, right? It differentiates between an admission to the death of a free man and the death of a slave. It's just talking difference between compensation and a fine. So now the question arises, once the Gemara has explained that in reference to a slave, the Brisa's term kofir refers to the 30 shekel fine. The challenge to Rabba has gone away, okay? Because we don't have to say that the Brisa was discussing damages. So the question then is, why does the Gemara need to interpret the Brisa as referring also to damages in the case where the ox killed unintentionally? Okay? So the answer is that the Gemara can't accept that the Brisa meant only, this is important, that wherever kofir is paid for a free man, 30 shekels are paid for a slave, because it's stating the obvious. You don't need the Gemara to tell you something that's in the Parsha. Rather, that the Gemara says that the Brisa must be referring to the payment of damages. That's according to Ravat. But rather than explain that in every case in which there's a payment of damages for a free person, there's a similar payment for a slave, as Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak said in his challenge, the Gemara is interpreting the Brisa to be referring only to the usual manner at which the liability of the owner is established. In other words, through the testimony of witnesses. So the Brisa is just stating that there's never a case in which witnesses would testify to the killing, whether it's intentional or unintentional, where there's liability for a free man and not for a slave. Okay? In other words, as a buyer said, if you ever owe damages for a free man, you owe it for a slave. But the Brisa doesn't discuss the unusual case of one who admitted to this, his ox was killed without witnesses. Because in that case, there's no liability for a slave, even though there's liability for a free man, for the reasons we've explained. Guys, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Very straightforward. All right, let's go to the next thing quickly. Rava has innovated the notion that in cases in which there is no liability of kofir or 30 shekels, there is an obligation to pay damages. This concept is challenged. Rava said to Rabbah, if so, then one who killed a person with his fire unintentionally, according to the testimony of witnesses, in other words, witnesses testified that he lit a fire and it spread and it killed a person, should pay damages. Okay? So what we're trying to determine is here is we say, look, what happens with regards to a fire? Because kofir is only imposed for the death of your ox to a person. There was an argument, guys, with Rava and Abaya. Do you remember the case of Rava that said it was only, kofir was only for Keren, and Abaya said it was also for Keren, Shane, and Regel? Remember? But all of them agree that there's no kofir with regards to fire. That was in the Gemara in the 10th daf. So the Gemara is proposing maybe that damages should be paid, since the Torah does hold a person liable for damage caused by his fire. That was in the 2nd daf. Okay? So the Gemara says, is questioning Rava's response. He said, and where does Rava know that the one who set fire does not in fact pay damages? Okay. So the Gemara suggests a source. Perhaps he will say it's from which we learnt in the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is in 61b. We haven't gotten there yet. Okay. If one set fire to a stack of grain and there was a young goat bound to the stack and a slave that was near the stack, and even the slave, although he was not bound to the stack, was burnt with it, the one who set the fire is liable to pay for the young goat and the stack. Okay? Why is he not liable to pay for the slave? Because if the slave wasn't tied up, the slave should have got out of it. Okay? If the slave was bound to the stack and the young goat was near it, and even though the young goat wasn't tied to the sack, was burnt with it, the one who set fire is exempt. Although his fire caused the death of a slave, he's not obligated to pay for damages. Why do you think, guys?
I'll be honest, when I read that, I don't know.
Okay. So look, you can understand why there's an exemption for the young goat. The young goat was not tied up. Okay. So it could have been expected to flee from spreading the fire. That's not the what do you call it? The pyromaniac's fault. So the Gemara suggests the reason to be a monetary liability for the death of a slave only applies when the Torah imposes the 30 shekel fine, when one ox kills a slave. But in the case of a death caused by one's fire, the ox does not impose a fine. A payment of damages is not required either. Okay, so it's seeming to say that if there's no kofir, there's no damages. Damages takes the place of kofir. That's what it seems to imply. Okay, but there's a problem with that. There's a problem with it in 3 fronts. Number one is that, firstly, if you liable, a slave is considered property, right? So if you liable that your fire damages somebody's property and you pay, why should you not pay for damages to a slave? If you purely see it as property and not person, right? Do you not owe for burning somebody's property? Yes, in the Gemara, in the second daf, we learned that. Does that make sense? We learned that clearly.
Yeah, and in the previous section, we just covered it now. It just said that if the stack and the animal, those two things were paid for, so it means property is always paid for if there's a fire. So it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so Rabbi is saying to Rabbi, I don't understand. In a case, why is he bringing this up? Is he saying, look, Rabbi initially contested that there are, if you don't pay, he's saying, look, in the case of a fire and there's no coffee, I understand, but then why don't you pay for damages? Why don't you pay for damages? So we're saying, look, in the first case, we understand the slave wasn't tied down, so if he didn't leave and he died or was damaged, that's his problem. If the kid goat didn't escape, that's his problem, and there should be the payment for the stack. The bottom line of it is it comes down to a separate argument. There's an argument that we learned on the 22nd daf. Okay? Do you remember that the nature of liability switched between Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish? Rav Yochanan said that the Torah considered the spread of a fire like a person's arrows. Arthur, what do we mean like a person's arrows? When we did the 22nd daf?
If like a person's arrows, like maybe it means like killing or straight directly, like.
Exactly. So why Rav Yochanan said a person's arrows is it's the person's force. If somebody took an arrow and drew it and shot somebody and said, no, my arrow's my property killed you, nobody would get him off the hook. The arrow never flew by itself, meaning that if one set fire to a stack of grain and it killed a slave that was bound up, that Rav Yochanan would say is straightforward murder, because it's like one's own energy that's caused it. Okay? Reish Lakish said, no, fire is somebody's property, because it's within your property that you set it alight, and it leaves your property to go to another property, and just like your property damages, you're responsible for damages. But what's the halachic implication? Is that if your ox damages a person, you pay kofir, okay? Or at the very least, you pay damages. But according to Rav Yochanan, who says your fire is your own force because you started the fire, and therefore, if you started it with the intent to kill, if it was accidental, then just like you'd go to the city of refuge or whatever the case may be, that's accidental. You might not have meant to start the fire. If you did it on purpose, one gets the death penalty. That's why you don't pay damages. So whenever there's a case, according to Rav Yochanan, where you did it intentionally, like your ox killing intentionally, the person gets set to death. According to Reish Lakish, it's as if his property damages, and therefore you pay damages. Because you don't pay kofir when it comes to your fire. But you would pay the equivalent of damages, because it's seen as though your property damaged, right? So the Mishnah means that you're exempt from paying for all three items, the slave, the stack, and the kid goat. Since he is considered to kill the slave directly by shooting arrows at him, he's liable to the death penalty for murder. And therefore there's that principle, guys, kimle b'di rabba minay, exempting paying for any simultaneous monetary damage when a person's going to die from the death penalty, because we only enforce the higher penalty for an act caused simultaneously. So Rava, who challenged Rava, subscribes to the opinion of Reish Lakish, because Rava said, look, it's not, the slave was bound. In the case where the slave wasn't bound, you don't pay for damages because the slave could have ran away. When the slave is bound, Gavin, this is the difference. Rava is saying like Reish Lakish. She's agreeing with Reish Lakish that since Reish Lakish determines your fire as a property, then why don't you pay for damages? Because you're not going to get the death penalty. Now, we learned this in Sanhedrin. It's called groma. So if you tie somebody else up and wait for the tide to come in, remember you learned this with Ian Shapiro. Gavin and Ian Shapiro are going to write the book, How Do You Get Off Death Penalty Cases on Earth? And Rav Simcha Steiner kept saying that in Shemaim they hold you liable. But if there's an indirect sort of thing, the Beis Din, Kevin, can't give you the death penalty, Kevin. So, for example, if you push somebody in a pit, okay, and then they die of not having food and water. No, let me give the Gemara's example. They go into a pit and you remove the ladder. You haven't killed them. The lack of ladder killed them. Now, is Hashem going to hold you responsible? Absolutely. But the Beis Din can't hold you because it's groma, it's indirect. So this is seen as indirect according to Reish Lakish. According to Rav Yochanan, it's direct. The reason you don't pay, Rabbi says you don't pay damages is he holds by Rav Yochanan, which is the person's going to die at the death penalty, so you don't pay damages. Okay? Rava is saying, like Reish Lakish, it's a person's property, that's why he should pay damages. That's what the argument actually, in essence, comes down to. Okay. So, let's hit number 43. Okay, quickly. Just give me a sec, guys. So, quickly. The Gemara suggests a source. Perhaps you will say that he sees it from which we learned in the Mishnah. If one set fire to a stack of grain and there was a young goat bound to the stack and a slave that was near the stack, and even the slave, although was not bound, the stack was burnt in it, the one who set fire is liable to pay for the young goat in the stack, obviously, because the stack is motionless property. You paid for property, you damaged, and the young goat was tied in. But if the slave was bound to the stack and the kid was near it, even though the young goat was not bound to the stack, was burnt with it, the one who set the fire is exempt, although his fire caused the death of the slave, he's not obligated to pay damages. Fine. The Gemara rejects this proof. But Reish Lakish has said the latter cause of the Mishnah refers to where he set fire to the slave's very body, and therefore is not liable to pay for the slave, for he has committed an act of murder and therefore stands subject to the penalty greater than the payment death. The Mishnah then does not prove that where he is not liable to death, he is nevertheless not liable to damages. So there is a case in which Reish Lakish does say a person does get the death penalty. So Arthur, if he set him alive directly, that's like one's force, even according to Reish Lakish. According to Rav Yochanan,
again, it was very statically.
Okay, so Reish Lakish says if you set fire to a barn and a slave is tied within that barn, there's no death penalty because you pay for damages. It's indirect. It's your property that burns it. But if you set the slave alight, even Reish Lakish would agree with Rav Yochanan that it's as if you burnt him because it's direct contact. It has to be direct contact. Okay, so here, Rav is saying, well, how do you explain that Reish Lakish says that there's no payment for damages? Okay, because he says that there would be. It's your property damaging. It's not like, and he'd say no. Even Reish Lakish would say in a case where you set somebody alight directly, there's no damages because the person gets the death penalty. Another source, but you will say that Rava derives this premise from that which was taught in the Brisa. In some respects, the category through, so that question was answered. So now another possible source. In some respects, the category of damage through fire is more stringent than the category of damage through pit. For fire is more to consume both items that are fit for it and items that are not fit for it, which is a stringency that's not the case of pit. So if you remember that Rav Yochanan also had a stringency here. What was his stringency? Is that as far, how do I put this? Is that if a fire went next door to the property and scorched a neighbor's property where the field had already been plowed, or it burnt the stones, things that generally are not subject to fire consumption because they're not flammable. If it happened to have burned something not flammable, you're still liable. But if a donkey was carrying utensils and the donkey died in a pit, you're not liable for utensils. So we find here we're more stringent with the case of fire. Okay? So we're saying also we're more stringent with regards to fire, with regards to a human death, because if you have a look in Shmot, Exodus chapter 21:33, it says, an ox falls in it, which implies not a person according to Rashi, in the 53rd Gemara, which says, if one who digs or uncovers a pit is not liable for the death of a person who falls in it. Why? Because the verse says if an ox falls in it. So again, there's a leniency with regards to pit. So basically we say, look, in that particular case, fire is more stringent than pit. Because in the case of what? In the case of utensils. But not in the case, it seems, where a person dies in a fire. Because the verse in Exodus that says that if your ox falls in the pit, you pay for the dead ox, but it doesn't mention for a person. So there's that leniency with regards to a person because they should have looked where they were going. Okay? And there's a question that's posed now. Oh, just give me a few more minutes. I know you're catatonic. Guys,
What did you say, catatonic?
If you don't want to do it now, stop. I mean, if you really...
Now let's have a few more minutes.
Okay.
No, finish off that.
Let's finish it, David. It's like 5 minutes, less than 10 minutes, it's fine.
Okay. So look, it's basically the Gemara draws an inference. It says, whereas an additional stringency that fire pays, in other words, obligates the one who set it, pays damages for an unintentional death, which is not true of pit. The Brisa does not state, evidently, just as one is not liable to pay for a human death caused by his pit, he's also not liable to pay for a human death with regards to a fire. Okay? So, so what it's actually saying here, let me just see if I've got this 100% right, is that, just let me see if I've got this 100% right. Which is not true.
Guys, this is a pit stop.
Okay.
Yeah.
Evidently, I'm also tired, guys. Sorry. Evidently, just as one is not liable to pay for a human death caused by his pit, he's also not liable to pay for a human death caused by his fire. Okay. So what it's saying is it spoke like Yoda. Let me tell you how it spoke like Yoda. Oh, if you want a good laugh. It says, whereas an additional stringency that fire pays damages for an unintentional death, which is not true of pit, the Brisa does not state. That's a perfect Yoda statement.
Sure.
In other words, try we must. Instead of we must try. So it's basically, all it's saying is, guys, there's no evidence that you pay for a human death caused by a fire any more than you pay for the human death caused by a pit. Okay? And Rav Yochanan doesn't hold that way. That's how Reish Lakish holds. And we're talking here, by the way, of an unintentional death. We're not talking a purposeful death. So there, they both might agree. Again, when it's intentional, Reish Lakish says you pay damages. When if you set, in other words, there's a grain of wheat or whatever. Okay. And the person sets the grain alight and he's bound as a person, and then that person dies. Reish Lakish said it's as if his property did it, but if he set him alight directly with the flame, it's as if he does it, then he gets the death penalty. Rav Yochanan says, Reish Lakish determines that one's fire is like one's property. So if it's indirect, he doesn't get the death penalty. But Rav Yochanan says, it's just like you shoot an arrow and it leaves your hand. It might be your property, but your force caused it. It's the same thing if you set fire to a stack of grain and you tied a slave or a person not to be able to escape. You caused it and that person is liable to the death penalty. It's the same as setting them alight directly. But with regards to unintentional death, both, it seems that the Gemara's got no evidence so far that you pay for fire any more than you pay for pit. Okay? That's how that's where we are. So the Gemara counters that no proof can be inferred from the submission. Perhaps the Tana taught only some of the stringencies of fire and left out others. In other words, it says, just as there are other stringencies that the Tana did not include in that brisa, as pointed out in 10a, we might still find it, okay? So the Gemara therefore revises its understanding of Rava's comment. Rather, Rava himself did not mean to challenge Rava. He simply pondered the matter. If one kills, so this is the conclusion of this statement, if one kills a person with his fire unintentionally, does he pay damages or does he not? Do we say that it's only in regard to an ox where the owner pays kofir if it kills intentionally, that we say that if it kills unintentionally, its owner pays damages? But in regard to one whose death is caused with fire, where the death was intentional, he does not pay kofir. Then if the death was unintentional, he does not pay damages either? Or do we perhaps say that since we regard his ox that killed unintentionally, even though there's no kofir obligation, he pays damages, then in regard to his fire also, even though the killing was with intent, he does not pay kofir. When the fire causes death unintentionally, he nevertheless pays damages. All right. So guys, do you understand what I'm saying there or not yet? Or I can give it to you in summary. Can any of you explain it back to me? Otherwise, I'll give you a summary.
Just give us a summary.
Summary.
All right. So look, what Rava pondered, he never challenged Rava, is he said, look, he wasn't sure if there with regards to unintentional or that there's damages, because he said, look, if your ox kills somebody intentionally, you have to pay kofir. Then you don't have to pay damages, because you either pay kofir or damages, right? And then he said, if it kills unintentionally, you don't pay kofir, therefore you pay damages. But with regards to a death that's caused with a fire, if the death was intentional and you don't pay kofir, then if the death was unintentional, do you pay damages? So he was saying, look, does this mirror the same argument? Because there's a thing with the buyer and a thing with Rava. What's the thing with the buyer and Rava? Is that the one says, look, if you don't pay kofir, you pay for damages. Okay, and the other one that says that if you don't pay kofir, you don't pay damages either. Does that make sense? So anything that there's no death of the animal, there's no kofir, and some say you still pay kofir. When there's no kofir to be paid because the animal's not to put to death, it says you still pay damages. So all Rava wants to know is what's the case of fire? Since there's no kofir for fire, do you pay damages in the case of an intentional killing if you're holding like Reish Lakish? Obviously, Rav Yochanan, we're talking about a case where it's indirect. According to Rav Yochanan, there's a death penalty. Or do you, for unintentional damages where there's no kofir, unintentional death, still pay damages or you don't? So he wants to see if it mirrors the case or not. So the Gemara concludes, we do not know the resolution to this inquiry. Let the question stand unresolved. Okay?
We can't even ask we can't even ask your Rav for this.
No.
If they didn't know, you saw him.
All right. So listen, guys, we only got up to 43b3, but I'm happy to stop there on this theme. I'm just going to repeat that last two sentences, then we are done. Okay? We're not going to finish the daf today. It's too bad. We're just not in this space for it. Okay. Rather, Rava himself did not mean to challenge Rava. He simply pondered the matter. If one kills a person with his fire unintentionally, does he pay damages or not? That's the question he pondered. Do we say that it's only in regard to an ox where its owner pays kofir if it kills intentionally, that we say that if it kills unintentionally the ox, its owner pays damages, but in regard to whose death with fire, where the death was intentional, he does not pay kofar. Then if the death was unintentional, he does not pay damages either. Or perhaps we say that since in regard to his ox that killed unintentionally, even though there was no kofar obligation, he pays damages. Then in regard to his fire, also, even if the killing was with intent, he does not pay kofar. When the fire caused death unintentionally, he nevertheless pays damages. So we can simplify this. We can simplify this as follows. All right, Art, we're going to finish now.
No, Karen, I'm listening. I'm here.
We're always saying if he's holding according to Reish Lakish, then if it's indirect, unless you're setting the person alight directly, it's considered, even if it's intentional, do you still pay damages? By the way, Hashem will remember. Hashem will hold the person murder. But it's saying if it's intentional for fire, do you pay damages or do you not? And for unintentional, do you pay damages or do you not? That's what he's saying. For fire. All right, guys, let's end off on this.
Damon?
Yeah?
Just quick question. If the guy say he deliberately bound the slave to the stack of grain, then he set it alight.
Yeah.
He wanted to kill the slave, and he wanted to kill the who else was it? The goat.
It doesn't even mean if it was a slave. It means that even
a human being.
A human being. We only said a slave in regards to the 30 shekel payment. But the bottom line is Rav Yochanan says indirect fire damage with intention to kill gets the death penalty. Obviously, all agree if it's unintentional, nobody gets the death penalty. Reish Lakish says Rav Yochanan says that it's direct, like you're shooting arrows. Doesn't mean that the arrow is your property and once it leaves your hand, it's not going to kill. But Reish Lakish determines it like your property, just like you've got to look after your property from damaging, so do you have to do it here. So he doesn't see it as murder if it's indirect, only if the person set alight the person directly. All right, Arthur, you ready for bed? Arthur doesn't need the as a piece.
Long time ago, bro.